She was 9 months pregnant when she followed her husband to that construction site at 3 in the morning. What she saw through that foggy window would shatter everything she believed about her marriage. But here is what her husband never expected. When he came home the next day, the house was sold, his wife had vanished, and a restraining order was waiting with his name on it. He thought she was weak. He thought she was broken. He thought he had already won. He was dead wrong. This story has a twist at the end that will leave you speechless. Stay until the final chapter. And if you love stories about women who fight back, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You do not want to miss what comes next. The morning my life began to unravel started like every other morning in the Whitmore estate. I woke up alone in a bed that cost more than most people's cars, reaching across cold Egyptian cotton sheets for a husband who was never there. My hand found nothing but empty space. The clock on the nightstand read 6:47 in the morning. Grant had been gone for at least 3 hours, maybe longer. His side of the bed was so perfectly undisturbed that I wondered if he had slept there at all. The pillow still held the indent from 3 nights ago, the last time I remembered him actually lying beside me. I pushed myself up slowly, my 8-month pregnant belly making every movement feel like an athletic event. The baby kicked hard against my ribs, a sharp jab that made me wince and smile at the same time. I placed my hand over the spot, feeling the outline of a tiny foot pressing against my skin. "Good morning to you too, little one," I whispered into the empty room. "At least you are happy to see me." The Whitmore estate sat on 4 acres of manicured perfection in Greenwich, Connecticut, 6 bedrooms that nobody slept in, 8 bathrooms with marble countertops imported from Italy, a kitchen that had been featured in Architectural Digest, where I made toast alone every morning, and me, wandering through rooms so large that my footsteps echoed off the floor like I was haunting my own home. I had given up everything for this life. My career as a litigation attorney at one of Manhattan's top firms, my tiny but perfect apartment in Brooklyn with the fire escape where I used to drink wine and watch the sunset, my friends who slowly stopped calling after I moved to the suburbs because Grant said it was better for the family we were building together. He said a lot of things back then. I believed every single word that came out of his beautiful, lying mouth. The nursery was ready and waiting. Pale blue walls that I had painted myself because Grant said hiring someone would be impersonal. White furniture arranged exactly how the designer suggested. A mobile of silver stars hanging above the crib, catching the morning light and scattering tiny rainbows across the ceiling. I stood in the doorway of that perfect room and tried to feel excited about the baby coming in 3 weeks. Instead, I felt the familiar weight of loneliness pressing down on my chest like a physical thing, heavy and suffocating and impossible to escape. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter downstairs. I waddled down the spiral staircase, one hand on the railing, one hand supporting my belly, and grabbed it before the notification disappeared. A text from Grant: "Emergency board meeting running long. Will be home late tonight. Do not wait up for me. Love you." I stared at that message for a long time, reading it over and over until the words lost all meaning. Love you. 2 simple words that used to make my heart race with joy. Now they felt like punctuation at the end of a sentence he did not mean, typed out of habit rather than feeling. I made myself a cup of herbal tea that I could not drink because of the heartburn, and I sat down at the kitchen table to review the guest list for the baby shower that Grant had insisted on throwing. 200 guests, most of whom I had never met, $50,000 for a single afternoon party, flowers imported from Holland because Connecticut roses were not good enough for a Whitmore event. I had wanted something small and intimate, maybe 10 close friends gathered in our backyard with store-bought cupcakes and cheap champagne and genuine laughter. But Grant had looked at me like I had suggested we hold the party in a garbage dump. The Whitmore name demands a certain standard, he had said with that patient smile he used when he thought I was being naive. People expect things from us, Vivian. We cannot disappoint them. The Whitmore name. I had taken that name with such pride and joy 3 years ago, standing at the altar in a designer gown that cost more than my first car. Now that name felt like a chain wrapped around my neck, beautiful and golden and absolutely suffocating. I was sorting through the response cards when the mail arrived with its usual thud against the front door. Bills went directly to Grant's accountant without me ever seeing them. Invitations went to his assistant, who managed our social calendar with military precision, but the monthly credit card statement, that landed in my hands purely out of old habit. My attorney brain had never fully turned off. even after 2 years of playing the perfect trophy wife. I used to review contracts for a living, spending hours searching for hidden clauses and buried traps. Now I reviewed credit card statements with the same obsessive attention, even though I kept telling myself I was not looking for anything suspicious. But that morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. $47,000 charged to Cartier 3 weeks ago. I touched my bare neck, felt the absence of jewelry at my empty wrist. I had not received any gifts. $3,200 at the Peninsula Hotel, dated last Tuesday, client dinner, according to Grant's calendar. But I knew the Peninsula did not charge $3,000 for dinner. $800 at a florist called La Maison Fleur, a name I had never heard before. For flowers I had certainly never seen. My hands started shaking so badly that I dropped the statement on the granite counter. I pressed my palms flat against the cold stone, trying to steady myself, trying to breathe. There is an explanation. I told myself firmly, there is always a reasonable explanation. Grant loves me. I am being paranoid and emotional and pregnant. But the voice in my head, the one I had been desperately ignoring for months, whispered something different. Receipts do not lie, Vivian. Husbands do. I picked up my phone with trembling fingers and called the only person in the world who would tell me the truth. Margot Brennan answered on the second ring, her voice scratchy with exhaustion from her overnight shift at Mount Sinai Hospital. Viv, she mumbled, it is not even 8 in the morning. Someone better be dead. I cannot sleep. I said, hating how small my voice sounded. And something is wrong. I can feel it in my bones. There was rustling on the other end, the sound of Margot sitting up and becoming alert. What do you mean something is wrong? Is it the baby? No, the baby is fine. It is Grant. Silence stretched between us. Margot had never liked Grant. She had stood beside me at my wedding with a smile on her face and doubt in her eyes, and she had never pretended otherwise. What did he do? Her voice was quiet now, careful. I do not know yet. Maybe nothing. Maybe I am being paranoid. Margot laughed, but there was no humor in it. Vivian Calloway, you were the most ruthless contract attorney at your firm. You do not get paranoid. You get accurate. If your gut is telling you something is wrong, then something is wrong. Can you come over this afternoon, I asked. I need someone to help me think clearly. I will be there at 2. And Viv, whatever is happening, you are not alone in this. Remember that. I hung up and placed my hand on my belly. The baby had stopped kicking. The house was silent around me. All 6,000 square feet of empty rooms and expensive furniture and a life that looked perfect from the outside. But I knew the truth now. Perfect is just a prison with better lighting. And I was about to find out exactly how trapped I really was. The baby shower was held on a Saturday in late September. The weather was perfect. Not a single cloud in the bright blue sky. The decorations were flawless, exactly as the event planner had promised. And I stood at the entrance of the enormous white tent we had erected on the back lawn, greeting guests with a smile that made my face ache from the effort. Grant was late. He had texted that he was stuck in a meeting on a Saturday for a baby shower that he himself had insisted on planning down to the last detail. I told the guests he would be here any minute. I told myself the same thing, even though I no longer believed it. 200 people filled the Whitmore estate that afternoon. Women in designer dresses that cost more than my monthly salary used to be. Men in casual blazers that probably cost more than my first apartment's rent. They cooed over the decorations. They placed their hands on my belly without asking permission, as if my body had become public property the moment I became pregnant. They told me how lucky I was, how beautiful I looked, how Grant must be absolutely thrilled about becoming a father. I smiled and nodded and died a little inside with every lie I had to tell. Margot found me hiding near the champagne fountain, tucked behind a tower of pastel macarons, trying to catch my breath between conversations. You look like you are about to pass out, she said bluntly. When did you eat last? I cannot remember. This morning, maybe. Or was it last night? She grabbed my arm and pulled me toward a quieter corner of the tent, away from the crowd. Vivian, you are 8 months pregnant. You cannot keep skipping meals. You need to take better care of yourself. I am fine, I said automatically. You have said that 4 times today already. She looked at me with those sharp brown eyes that never missed anything. And every single time you say it, you look less fine than before. What is really going on? Before I could answer, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. 2 women were standing near the dessert table, champagne glasses in hand, speaking in voices that were just loud enough to carry across the tent. "Did you see his assistant?" The first woman said. "The blonde one with the legs. She has been at every single company event lately. I heard they were at the Peninsula Hotel last Tuesday." The second woman replied with obvious relish. "My sister works in housekeeping there. She said they were in the penthouse suite together until well after midnight." My hand went instinctively to my belly. The baby kicked hard, as if he could sense my distress through my skin. Margot's face had gone pale. "Viv," she started. I held up my hand to stop her. "Not here. Not now. I cannot fall apart in front of 200 people." I forced myself to keep smiling. I forced myself to keep breathing. And I filed those whispered words away in my heart like a knife I was not ready to use yet. Grant arrived an hour later than he had promised. He was not alone. She walked 2 steps behind him, carrying a gift bag with a perfect pink ribbon. She was young, maybe 29 or 30, with blonde hair that fell in perfect waves past her shoulders and a dress that showed exactly the right amount of leg. She moved like she owned the entire world, and when she looked at me, there was something in her eyes that I could not quite name. Triumph, maybe, or pity. Grant kissed my cheek with practiced ease. "Sorry I am late, baby. The Henderson meeting ran much longer than expected. This is Sloane Prescott, my executive assistant. She offered to help me carry the gift since it was so heavy." Sloane extended her hand toward me. Her grip was firm and confident. Her smile was absolutely perfect, like something out of a magazine advertisement. And her eyes never left my face, watching for my reaction. "You must be so exhausted," she said sweetly, "carrying all that extra weight around. Grant has told me that you have been so fragile lately. I hope you are taking care of yourself." The word fragile hit me like a physical slap across the face. I had never been fragile a single day in my entire life. I had graduated top of my class at Columbia Law School. I had argued cases in front of federal judges who tried to intimidate me. I had built a career from absolutely nothing. But standing there in my own backyard, 8 months pregnant, watching this woman touch my husband's arm with easy, intimate familiarity, I felt fragile for the first time in my life. "Thank you so much for the gift," I said. My voice was steady even though my hands were shaking. "It is so thoughtful of you to come all this way on a Saturday." "Oh, I do not mind at all." She smiled at Grant, and something passed between them that made my stomach turn. I would do absolutely anything for the Whitmore family. The way she said family made bile rise in my throat. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of presents and finger foods and conversations I would not remember later. I watched Grant and Sloane from across the tent whenever I could. I watched how her fingers brushed his arm when she handed him a drink. I watched how he looked at her when he thought nobody was paying attention. I watched how they stood just a little too close together. And I knew, with the ancient certainty that comes from being a woman, from having that gut instinct that men always dismiss as paranoia or hormones, I knew with absolute clarity that my husband was sleeping with this woman. That night, after all 200 guests had finally gone home and the caterers had cleaned up every trace of the party and Grant had fallen asleep beside me, smelling of champagne and perfume that was not mine, I lay in the darkness with my hands on my belly and made a decision. I was not going to confront him. I was not going to scream or cry or throw things like a hysterical pregnant woman. That was exactly what he would expect. That was probably what the other wives had done, the ones who ended up with nothing. I was going to wait. I was going to watch. I was going to document absolutely everything. And when the time was right, I was going to destroy Grant Whitmore completely. I just did not know that before I could save myself. I would have to survive the worst night of my entire life. 2 weeks after the baby shower, I woke up at 3 in the morning with an urgent need to use the bathroom. This had become routine in my 9th month of pregnancy. The baby was pressing on my bladder constantly, making sleep almost impossible. What was not routine was reaching across the bed and finding Grant's side completely empty and cold. I lay there for a long moment, listening to the silence of the enormous house. No shower running in the master bathroom, no light under the door, just darkness and the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I picked up my phone from the nightstand and checked Grant's location. We shared our locations with each other on an app. It was something he had suggested early in our marriage, back when I still believed that transparency and trust meant the same thing. His little blue dot pulsed on the screen, showing him at the Henderson construction site on the other side of town. At 3 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday, A passive woman would have rolled over and gone back to sleep. A passive woman would have told herself there was a reasonable explanation, that her husband was simply a hardworking man dedicated to his business, that she was being paranoid and emotional, and all the other things pregnant women get accused of being. I stopped being passive the moment I passed the bar exam 12 years ago. I pulled on a bathrobe over my nightgown, the silk sliding over my swollen belly. I slipped my feet into the only shoes that still fit me, a pair of old sneakers with the laces loosened, and I drove across town in the darkness, my pregnant belly pressed against the steering wheel, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The construction site was completely dark except for the security lights around the perimeter, casting harsh shadows across the half-finished buildings. But Grant's black Mercedes was parked behind a trailer in the back corner of the lot, tucked away where it could not be seen from the main road. And right next to it was a white BMW that I recognized immediately from the company parking lot. Sloane Prescott's car. I parked on the street about 50 feet away and walked toward the trailer on legs that would not stop shaking. The September night was cool, but I was sweating through my nightgown. Every step felt like walking toward the edge of a cliff, knowing I was about to see something that would destroy me. The windows of the trailer were fogged up from the inside, but there was a small gap in the curtains where they did not quite meet. I pressed my face close to the cold glass and looked inside, and I saw them together. They were on a leather couch in the corner of the trailer office. Her blonde hair was spread across a pillow like a golden fan. His face was buried in the curve of her neck. His hand was moving down her body in a way that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. He was looking at her the way he used to look at me when we first met, when he was still pretending to be the man I thought I married. My hands moved on their own, operating on pure instinct. I pulled out my phone, I made sure the flash was turned off, and I started taking photographs through the gap in the curtains. 1, 2, 3, 12 photographs in total, each one more damning than the last. My attorney brain had taken over completely, pushing aside the screaming agony in my chest. Evidence, documentation, chain of custody. I was building a legal case against my own husband while tears streamed silently down my face and dripped onto my phone screen. Then Sloane looked toward the window. Our eyes met through the fog. For one long, terrible moment, nobody moved at all. I saw recognition flash across her face as she realized who was standing outside in the darkness. And I saw something else too. Something that looked almost like satisfaction, almost like victory. She smiled slowly. Then she said something to Grant that I could not hear. His head snapped up. Through the foggy glass, our eyes met for one eternal second that seemed to stretch into infinity. I saw the shock on his face. I saw the guilt. And then I saw something else entirely. Something that looked almost like relief, as if he had been waiting for this moment, as if he was finally tired of pretending to love me. The trailer door flew open with a bang. Grant rushed outside, half-dressed, his expensive shirt unbuttoned to his waist, his belt still undone. "Vivian, wait, this is not what it looks like. Let me explain everything to you." I held up my phone, showing him the screen full of photographs. My voice came out calm and cold as ice. Nothing like the screaming agony I felt inside my chest. "I do not need an explanation. Grant, I have 12 photographs, and I know exactly what the infidelity clause in our prenuptial agreement says." He stopped in his tracks like he had walked into an invisible wall. The color drained from his face completely. "You should know something important," I continued. "I was a litigation attorney before I became your wife. I know exactly what these photographs are worth in divorce court. I know exactly how much you stand to lose." I turned and walked back toward my car. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. But I refused to let him see me stumble. Grant chased after me, his face twisted with sudden fury. "You will regret this," he shouted. "You have nothing without me. Nothing at all. You are nobody." I got in my car and locked the doors. Grant banged on the window with his fist, but I did not flinch. I looked at him through the glass. This man I had loved with my whole heart. This man I had given up everything for. This man who had been sleeping with another woman while I carried his child. "I have everything I need," I said calmly. "And tomorrow morning, I am getting the best divorce lawyer in Connecticut." I drove away without looking back at him once. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like myself again. I had the evidence. I had the prenup with the fidelity clause. I had him. I thought I had won the war. I was so completely wrong. Catherine Aldridge's office occupied the entire top floor of a glass tower in downtown Hartford. The walls were lined with framed awards and photographs of her shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. She was known throughout legal circles as the surgeon because she did not negotiate divorces. She dissected them with precision. She was exactly the kind of attorney I desperately needed. I sat across from her massive mahogany desk with a folder full of evidence, photographs from the construction site, credit card statements showing unexplained expenses, a detailed timeline of every suspicious absence and late-night meeting. I laid it all out like I was presenting a case to a jury, letting my old attorney instincts take control. Catherine listened without interrupting a single time. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her sharp eyes missed absolutely nothing. When I finally finished my presentation, she leaned back in her leather chair and steepled her fingers beneath her chin. "The photographs are excellent quality," she said slowly. "The credit card trail is solid and well documented. The timeline is thorough and professional. Unfortunately, none of it matters." The words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. "What do you mean it does not matter? I have irrefutable proof of his affair. The prenup has an infidelity clause. I read the entire document myself before I signed it 3 years ago." Catherine pulled a thick document from her desk drawer. She had already obtained a copy of my prenuptial agreement from the county records office. Of course she had. That was why she was the very best at her job. "You read the infidelity clause," she said, "but did you read the exception buried on page 47? I felt ice spreading through my veins. "What exception?" She slid the document across the desk and pointed to a paragraph hidden in dense, technical legal language. I read it 3 times before I understood what it meant. "Infidelity must be proven by direct admission from the accused party or criminal conviction. Photographic evidence, witness testimony, and financial records shall not constitute sufficient proof absent sworn confession." My hands started shaking uncontrollably. "So he can cheat on me openly, and I get absolutely nothing unless he confesses. The situation is even worse than that." Catherine's voice was matter of fact, completely clinical. "The house is held in the Whitmore Family Trust. Your name is not on the deed. The cars are all registered as company vehicles. The bank accounts are in his name alone. Even the jewelry he gave you reverts to the trust upon divorce. Legally speaking, Vivian, you own nothing at all." I stared at her in disbelief. "Nothing. Nothing except personal property you brought into the marriage and any separate assets you maintained independently." She paused. "Do you have any separate assets?" $50,000, an inheritance from my grandmother that passed away 4 years ago. I moved it to a private account about 6 months ago. That is something, but against an estate worth $180 million, it is not very much. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something against her pristine walls. Instead, I sat perfectly still and let the full weight of my situation crush me like a physical force. Then Catherine said something that changed everything I thought I knew. "This is the 3rd time I have seen this exact prenuptial agreement." I looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" She pulled another folder from her desk. This one was older, worn at the edges, clearly from her archives. "Grant Whitmore was married before you. Twice before. Actually, his first wife was named Nora Ashford. They were married for 4 years back in his 20s. She tried to divorce him after discovering he was having an affair with his secretary." "What happened to her?" Catherine's expression darkened considerably. "The Whitmore family had her committed for psychiatric evaluation. She was held for 72 hours at a private facility they essentially controlled. When she was finally released, she signed away all rights to any Whitmore assets in exchange for her freedom. She disappeared after that. Sealed records. Non-disclosure agreement? Nobody has heard from her in over 10 years. The room seemed to spin around me like a carousel. "You said twice," I whispered. "Who was the second wife?" "Her name was Lauren Beck. She married Grant about 5 years after his divorce from Nora. The marriage lasted only 2 years. She died under suspicious circumstances 3 months after filing for divorce." I could not breathe. The room was too small, the air too thick. Catherine leaned forward across her desk. "I am not saying that Grant Whitmore killed his second wife. I am saying there is a clear pattern here, a pattern of systematically destroying women who try to leave him. And right now, Vivian, you are the 3rd woman walking directly into that pattern." I placed both hands on my belly protectively. The baby kicked against my palms, as if sensing my fear. "What am I supposed to do?" "You have exactly 2 options. Option 1, you take whatever settlement he offers you. Sign whatever documents his lawyers put in front of you. and disappear quietly like Nora did. Option 2. You choose to fight back. But fighting means finding evidence that cannot possibly be dismissed. It means finding Nora Ashford and convincing her to break her silence after 10 years. It means going to war against a family that has been successfully covering up crimes for decades. How long would that take? Months at minimum? Possibly much longer. I do not have months. I am due to give birth in 3 weeks. Catherine nodded grimly. I know, which is exactly why I need you to understand something very clearly. If you choose to fight, Grant will come after you with absolutely everything he has. He will try to take your child away from you. He will try to destroy your reputation completely. He will try to break you the way he broke the others. I sat in that office, 8 months pregnant, with no money, no home, and no apparent way out. And I made the only decision I could live with. I want to find Nora Ashford, I said firmly. Catherine smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator who had finally found worthy prey. Then let us get started immediately. I spent the next 48 hours doing something I had never done before in my 3 years of marriage to Grant Whitmore. I took complete and total control of my own life. The Whitmore Family Trust was a fortress of legal protections, designed specifically to prevent outsiders from accessing the family wealth. But every fortress has a weakness somewhere. I found mine buried in paragraph 17 of the trust documents, hidden under pages of dense, impenetrable financial language. Any property held by the trust may be transferred in emergency circumstances with the signature of the primary trustee and the beneficiary spouse. In cases of property abandonment exceeding 72 hours, the primary trustee may act unilaterally without additional consent. Grant was supposed to be at a real estate development conference in Dubai for 5 days. His assistant had blocked out his calendar and booked his flights weeks in advance. But I knew he was not actually in Dubai. He was with Sloan at a luxury hotel in Manhattan, probably celebrating what he thought was my complete defeat. He had effectively abandoned the property, and the primary trustee of the Whitmore Family Trust was not Grant himself. It was his grandmother. Dorothy Whitmore lived alone in the original family mansion, a beautiful Victorian estate on a quiet tree-lined street in Old Greenwich. She was 71 years old, sharp as a surgical blade, and according to everyone in the extended family, she absolutely despised what her grandson had become over the years. I drove to her house on a Tuesday morning, my belly so large I could barely fit behind the steering wheel anymore. Every pothole made me wince with discomfort, but I was not going to let physical pain stop me from fighting for my future. Dorothy answered the heavy oak door herself. She was small and elegant, with perfectly styled silver hair and eyes the same cold blue as Grant's. But where Grant's eyes held cruelty and calculation, Dorothy's held something else entirely, something that looked almost like hope. I wondered when you would finally figure it out, she said calmly. Come inside. She led me into her parlor, a beautiful room filled with antique furniture and photographs of the Whitmore family going back 5 generations. Grant's baby pictures hung on the wall next to portraits of ancestors who had built the family fortune over 100 years ago. You know, I said quietly, about Grant, about what he does to women. Dorothy set down her teacup with a soft clink. I raised that boy after his parents died in the accident. I gave him everything a child could want: money, opportunity, love. And somewhere along the way, he became a monster. She looked at me with those sharp blue eyes. The monster is my fault. I enabled him for far too long. But you are the first wife smart enough to actually fight back. I need your help desperately. I know you do. Dorothy stood and walked to an antique writing desk in the corner. She pulled out a folder of legal documents. I have been waiting for years for someone brave enough to ask. The papers were emergency transfer documents. They would move the Greenwich estate out of the Whitmore Family Trust and into a new trust entirely. A trust with a completely different beneficiary. Me and my unborn child. If you sign these papers, I said slowly, Grant will never forgive you for this betrayal. Dorothy laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. My grandson has been waiting for me to die for the past 20 years so he can finally inherit my personal share of the trust. Let him wait a little longer. I would rather give everything I own to a complete stranger than watch him destroy another innocent woman. She signed the papers with a flourish. I signed them with shaking hands. By noon that day, the $4 million Whitmore estate in Greenwich legally belonged to a shell company controlled by Dorothy herself, with me named as the sole beneficiary. Grant would come home from his mistress's bed to find his ancestral family home sold to his own grandmother. The thought gave me more satisfaction than I had felt in years. But I was not finished yet. I packed exactly one suitcase with the essentials I would need: legal documents, my laptop, computer, the photographs from the construction site, a few pieces of maternity clothing that still fit over my massive belly. I left everything else behind without a second thought. The expensive jewelry, the designer clothes, the life I had built with a man who had never truly loved me. Margot was waiting for me at her tiny apartment in Queens. It was a cramped, one-bedroom walk-up with a broken elevator and walls thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing at all hours. The kitchen was barely big enough for one person to stand in. It was the most beautiful place I had ever seen in my entire life. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Margot asked as she helped me carry my single suitcase up 4 flights of stairs. "Once you disappear from his life, there is no going back to the way things were." I looked at her, my best friend since college, the only person who had never stopped telling me the uncomfortable truth, even when I did not want to hear it. I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life. I changed my phone number that afternoon. I deleted all my social media accounts permanently. I became invisible to everyone in the world except the few people I chose to trust with my location. For 2 wonderful days, I felt completely safe. For 2 days, I thought I had won the war against Grant Whitmore. I did not know that he had already found exactly where I was hiding. Labor started at 3 o'clock in the morning on a cold Thursday in October. I woke up in Margot's narrow bed with a cramping sensation that I initially thought was just another Braxton Hicks contraction. Nothing to worry about, just my body practicing for the real thing. By 4 o'clock, the cramps were coming every 15 minutes like clockwork. By 5 o'clock, I knew with absolute certainty that this was real labor, not a false alarm. Margot was working the overnight shift at Mount Sinai Hospital. I called her cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She was probably in surgery or dealing with an emergency. I tried 3 more times with the same result. I was completely alone. I called an Uber and rode to the nearest hospital by myself. The contractions were getting stronger with every passing minute. Waves of pain that made me grip the car seat and breathe through tightly clenched teeth. The driver kept glancing at me nervously in the rearview mirror, his face pale with barely disguised panic. "Please do not have the baby in my car," he said desperately. "I am trying my best." I gasped through another contraction. The labor lasted 18 excruciating hours. 18 hours of agony unlike anything I had ever experienced. 18 hours of nurses asking where my support person was, of me saying he is coming. He will be here soon, knowing deep down that nobody was coming to help me at all. My son Theodore was born at 11:47 at night. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, a full head of dark hair, eyes that would later turn the same warm brown as mine. The nurses placed him on my chest, and I wept with a mixture of overwhelming awe and devastating loneliness that I cannot possibly describe with words. I took a photograph of my beautiful son. I sent it to nobody. For 12 peaceful hours, it was just me and Theo in that quiet hospital room, learning each other's faces, existing in a fragile bubble of temporary peace. Then Grant walked through the door. He was carrying an enormous teddy bear in one arm and a bouquet of red roses in the other. His smile was bright and confident, like a man arriving at a party he was hosting himself. "There you are," he said pleasantly. "Did you really think you could hide from me forever, Vivian?" My blood turned to ice in my veins. "How did you find me?" He laughed like I had told a funny joke. "I have lawyers monitoring every hospital in 3 states. They flagged your insurance information the moment you checked in for delivery." He walked slowly toward the bed, toward my son. "Now let me see my child." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to protect my baby. I pulled Theo closer to my chest, shielding him with my arms. Get out of this room." Grant stopped walking. His pleasant smile faded completely. "Excuse me?" I said, "Get out. You do not get to be here. You do not get to pretend to be a concerned father after everything you have done to me." His eyes went cold and flat, like a shark's eyes. The charming mask he wore in public slipped away entirely, revealing something cruel and calculating underneath. "Let me tell you exactly what is going to happen," he said softly. He pulled a folder from his expensive jacket pocket and dropped it on my hospital bed. "I filed an emergency custody petition this morning. I have statements from 3 different doctors saying you are mentally unstable. I have documented evidence of your erratic behavior, including fleeing our home in the middle of the night with no explanation, making paranoid accusations about affairs that supposedly never happened. A judge signed a temporary custody order 2 hours ago. I could not breathe. My arms tightened around Theo involuntarily. You have exactly 72 hours to surrender Theodore to my custody for psychiatric evaluation. Grant smiled again, but there was no warmth in it whatsoever. If you try to run, I will have you arrested for kidnapping your own child. I stared at him with horror. This man I had married. This man I had loved completely. This man who was trying to take my newborn son, using the exact same playbook he had used against Nora Ashford 10 years before. You will not win this, I said. My voice was shaking badly, but I forced the words out anyway. I know about Nora. I know about Lauren. I know exactly what you are. Something flickered in Grant's eyes. Fear, maybe, or surprise that I had discovered his secrets. But he recovered quickly. You know nothing, he said dismissively. And in 72 hours, you will have nothing at all. Not your son, not your reputation, not your sanity. He leaned closer, dropping his voice to a threatening whisper. The Whitmore family has owned this town for 3 generations. The judge who signed that custody order golfs with my uncle every Sunday. The district attorney went to prep school with me. You cannot win this fight, Vivian. You never could. He walked out of my hospital room without looking back. I sat in that bed, holding my newborn son against my chest, feeling the walls closing in around me from every direction. I had 72 hours. 72 hours before they took Theo away from me. 72 hours before Grant won again, just like he had won against every woman who had ever tried to fight back. Margot found me an hour later. She had gotten my desperate messages and raced from her shift the moment she could get away. She took one look at my face and knew immediately that something terrible had happened. What did he do? I told her everything. The custody order, the psychiatric evaluation, the 72-hour deadline hanging over my head. When I finished speaking, Margot sat down on the edge of my hospital bed and took my hand firmly in hers. Do not you dare give up, she said fiercely. You are the smartest person I have ever known, the most stubborn, the most ruthless when you absolutely need to be. Grant Whitmore has never faced someone like you before. I looked at Theo sleeping peacefully in my arms. So small, so innocent, so completely dependent on me to protect him from his own father. I cannot let him win. I said, but I do not know how to stop him. Margot squeezed my hand tightly. Then we will figure it out together. I had exactly 72 hours to destroy a $180 million empire, and I knew precisely where I needed to start. Nora Ashford had vanished from public life over 10 years ago, but people never truly disappear completely. They leave traces behind them everywhere they go, forwarding addresses, property records, utility bills in different names, court documents, tax filings. I had spent years as a litigation attorney tracking down hostile witnesses who desperately did not want to be found. This situation was no different from any case I had worked before, except everything was different now. I was operating on almost no sleep, my body still recovering from childbirth, my mind racing with terror for my son's safety. Every hour that passed brought me closer to the moment when Grant's lawyers would arrive to take Theo away from me forever. I started with public records, working from Margot's cramped kitchen table, while Theo slept in a borrowed bassinet beside me. Nora Ashford had owned a small house in Connecticut before her marriage to Grant. After the divorce, that house had been sold to a trust. The trust was managed by a law firm in Hartford. The law firm had a branch office in Portland, Maine. That was my starting point. I cross-referenced the trust documents with property tax records throughout coastal Maine. I found 3 properties that had been purchased in the same year Nora disappeared from Connecticut. One was a small commercial building. One was empty land awaiting development. The third was a modest cottage on a rocky stretch of coastline. The cottage was registered to a woman named Eleanor Shaw. Eleanor, Nora. The names were not identical, but they shared enough letters to be more than coincidence. I called Catherine Aldridge from Margot's apartment, keeping my voice low so I would not wake the baby. I think I found her, I said. Catherine was silent for a long moment. That is much faster than I expected. Are you certain? No, but I do not have time to be completely certain about anything. I have less than 48 hours left before they take my son. Catherine understood the urgency immediately. Go talk to her. If she agrees to break her NDA and testify about what Grant did to her, we might have enough evidence to get the custody order thrown out entirely. Margot drove me to Maine that same day. 8 hours in her beat-up Honda Civic, stopping every 2 hours so I could feed Theo and change his diaper. We arrived at the cottage just as the sun was setting over the Atlantic Ocean. It was a small, weathered place, gray shingles and white trim, set back from a rocky beach covered in seaweed. Seagulls circled overhead, crying mournfully. The only other sound was the waves crashing against the shore. I walked up the gravel path and knocked on the front door. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. The door opened just at a crack. A woman peered out at me with eyes full of fear and suspicion. She was thin, maybe 42 years old, with prematurely gray hair and deep lines carved around her mouth. She looked like someone who had spent an entire decade looking over her shoulder constantly, waiting for danger to find her again. Whatever you are selling, I am not interested. I am not selling anything. I held up both my empty hands to show I meant no harm. My name is Vivian Calloway. I was married to Grant Whitmore. The woman's face went completely white. She tried to close the door, but I stepped forward quickly. Please, I have a newborn son. Grant is trying to take him away from me using the exact same tactics he used against you. The psychiatric hold, the corrupt judge, the prenup designed to leave me with nothing. I know what happened to you, Nora, and I know you have been hiding for 10 years because you are terrified he will do it again. She stared at me with tears forming in her eyes. How did you find me? I used to be an attorney. A good one. Before Grant took that away from me too. Nora laughed, but it was a broken sound. Half sob and half genuine amusement at the absurdity of our situation. He did the same thing to you, she said quietly. It was not a question. Everything. The isolation, the gaslighting, the other woman. I thought I was going crazy. I thought it was all my fault. Nora opened the door wider. Come inside. I need to see the baby first. I showed her Theo, still sleeping peacefully in his car seat. Nora looked at him for a long, silent moment, and something fundamental shifted in her expression. You said 48 hours, she asked. Less than that now. Nora studied my face carefully. I do not know what she saw there, Amaya, but it seemed to satisfy her. If I help you, I lose everything, she said slowly. My settlement, my protection, everything I built over the last 10 years. I know, and I am asking you anyway. She nodded once, decisively. Then let me show you what I have been keeping all these years. She led me to a back room filled with boxes stacked floor to ceiling, file boxes, document boxes, boxes stuffed with papers and photographs and audio recordings on old cassette tapes. I never stopped watching him, Nora said softly, after what he did to me. I swore that if he ever did it to another woman, and I would be ready to help her. I have been building a case against Grant Whitmore for 10 years. She pulled out a thick folder and handed it to me. And now, with your evidence and mine combined, we might finally have enough to bring him down completely. Nora's evidence was absolutely explosive. She had documented proof of bribes Grant had paid to the judge who committed her for psychiatric evaluation a decade ago. She had audio recordings of Grant threatening her, his voice cold and cruel on the old tapes, promising to destroy her completely if she ever spoke publicly about their marriage. She had medical records from her 72-hour hold at the private psychiatric facility, records that clearly showed the diagnosis had been predetermined before she even arrived for evaluation. And she had something else, something that made my blood run cold. Documentation of a third wife, a woman named Lauren Beck, who had married Grant in the years between Nora and me. Lauren Beck had died 3 months after filing for divorce from Grant. The official cause of death was suicide, an overdose of prescription sleeping pills in a hotel room in Manhattan. But Nora had discovered inconsistencies in the official story. Hotel security footage showed Lauren meeting with an unidentified man the night she died. The toxicology report mentioned substances that were not among her regular prescriptions. The detective who investigated her death had been promoted to chief of police just 6 months later, his promotion funded by an anonymous donor. This is not just adultery, I said, staring at the evidence spread across Nora's kitchen table. This is a criminal enterprise. Nora nodded grimly. Grant Whitmore has been systematically destroying women for over 20 years. The psychiatric holds, the corrupt judges, the rigged divorce settlements, and when someone gets too close to exposing him, when someone refuses to stay quiet, they end up like Lauren did. I thought about Grant standing in my hospital room, threatening to take Theo away from me. I thought about the psychiatric evaluation waiting for me if I failed to stop him. I thought about what happened to women who fought back against the Whitmore family and lost. What do we do with all of this evidence, I asked. Nora smiled. It was the first time I had seen her smile since I arrived. We take it completely public. Catherine Aldridge flew to Maine that night on a private charter. She brought a federal fraud investigator and an investigative journalist from a major national newspaper. We spent hours going through every piece of evidence, organizing it into a timeline that showed exactly how Grant Whitmore operated. Then I did something that surprised everyone in the room, including myself. I am not going to wait for the newspaper to publish their story. I announced, by the time that happens, Grant's lawyers will have found some way to suppress it. The judge in my custody case is in his pocket. The district attorney is in his pocket. Every institution that should protect people like me has been compromised. So what exactly do you propose? Catherine asked. I held up my phone. The newspaper can have the full investigation, but I am going to give the internet a preview first. At 2 in the morning, I posted a thread on social media. The title was simple and direct. My husband is a $180 million real estate developer. He is also a serial predator. Here's the proof. I included photographs with faces blurred for legal protection. I included screenshots of financial documents showing bribes to public officials. I included a timeline of Grant's 3 marriages and what had happened to each wife. I tagged every major news outlet, every women's advocacy organization, every investor who had ever done business with Whitmore Development. Then I went to sleep. When I woke up 4 hours later, the thread had been viewed over 2 million times. My phone was exploding with notifications. News outlets were requesting interviews. Grant's company was issuing frantic denials. The hashtag was trending nationally. But most importantly, 3 other women had already come forward. 3 women Grant had dated before Nora, before Lauren, before me. 3 women with remarkably similar stories of manipulation, abuse, and threats. The wall of silence that had protected Grant Whitmore for 2 decades was finally crumbling, and I had lit the match that started the fire. Margot burst into the room where I was feeding Theo, her face alight with fierce joy. Vivian, turn on the news right now. I grabbed the remote. Every channel was showing the exact same footage. Grant Whitmore being let out of his office building in handcuffs. His mother screaming hysterically at the cameras. Sloan Prescott being questioned by federal investigators. The judge who had signed my custody order had recused himself due to conflict of interest. The psychiatric evaluation had been canceled, and Grant Whitmore was being charged with fraud, witness tampering, and criminal conspiracy. I watched my husband's empire burn on national television while my newborn son slept peacefully in my arms. It should have felt like victory. Instead, I felt completely empty inside. Grant Whitmore did not go quietly into the night. 2 days after his arrest, he posted bail. $1 million, paid by the family trust that his grandmother had not yet managed to dissolve completely. He walked out of the courthouse in a perfectly tailored designer suit, surrounded by his team of expensive lawyers, looking like he was leaving a business meeting instead of a jail cell. That night, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost did not answer, but something told me I needed to hear what was coming. Vivian, Grant's voice was calm. Too calm. Did you really think a few tweets would destroy me? My family has owned this town for 3 generations. By this time next year, the charges will be dropped. The journalists will move on to other stories, and you will have nothing. I gripped the phone tighter. You are facing federal charges now. Grant, this is not your golf buddy's court anymore. He laughed. You have absolutely no idea what my family is capable of doing, but you are about to find out. The line went dead. 24 hours later, I understood what he meant. Grant's lawyers filed a motion to dismiss all charges, claiming the evidence had been obtained improperly through illegal means. They argued that Nora had violated her NDA, making her testimony inadmissible in court. They claimed the financial documents were stolen property, not leaked by whistleblowers. They painted me as a mentally unstable woman who had orchestrated a vicious smear campaign against her innocent husband. The motion was denied by the federal judge, but the message was crystal clear. Grant was going to fight until he had exhausted every legal option, every loophole, every corrupt connection he had built over the years. Then I received a letter at Margot's apartment. It arrived with no return address. Inside was a photograph of me walking Theo in his stroller near the apartment building. The image had been taken from a car parked across the street. On the back of the photograph, someone had written 2 words. I am watching. I called Catherine immediately with shaking hands. Someone is following me. Someone took this photograph. Catherine's voice was grim. I was afraid this might happen. Grant is trying to intimidate you. He knows the trial is going very badly for him, so he is resorting to threats and intimidation. What should I do? You document everything. You report it to the FBI, and you do not let him scare you into silence. That is exactly what he wants. That is how he wins. The next 3 months were the hardest of my entire life. Grant's trial became a national spectacle, covered by every major news network. Every day brought new revelations and shocking testimony. The bribes to judges, the falsified psychiatric evaluations, the suspicious circumstances surrounding Lauren Beck's untimely death. Witness after witness took the stand to describe the pattern of abuse and manipulation that Grant had perfected over 2 decades. Nora testified for hours. Her voice shook with emotion, but she never faltered once. She described her marriage, her attempted divorce, and the terrifying 72 hours she spent in a psychiatric facility for the crime of trying to leave her abusive husband. Sloane Prescott testified as well. She described how Grant had promised to marry her, how he had told her I was mentally unstable and dangerous, how she had believed every single lie until she saw her own name in the evidence against him. And then it was my turn to take the stand. I told the court absolutely everything. The affair, the birth I faced completely alone, the custody threats, the psychiatric evaluation designed specifically to take my son away from me. I spoke for 3 hours straight, and I did not cry, and I did not waver. When I finished, Grant's lead attorney stood up for cross-examination. "Mrs. Calloway," he said with a condescending smile, "you claim my client is a monster, but you stayed with him for 3 years. You lived in luxury. You chose to have a child with him. How do you explain that?" I looked directly at the jury, 12 ordinary people who had been chosen to decide the fate of a man worth $180 million. "Let me tell you something about abusive relationships," I said calmly. "The person who abuses you does not start as a monster. They start as the most charming person you have ever met. They make you feel special. They make you feel loved. And by the time you finally see who they really are, they have already isolated you from everyone who might help." I paused for a moment to let the words sink in. I stayed because I believed his lies. I stayed because I was pregnant and scared. But staying does not mean I deserved what happened to me. And every person listening right now who is trapped in a similar situation needs to know that it is never your fault. The courtroom was completely silent. Several jurors were openly wiping tears from their eyes. The defense attorney sat down slowly. He did not ask any more questions. The jury deliberated for 6 long hours. I sat in the courthouse hallway with Margot on one side and Nora on the other. Theo was with a trusted babysitter, the first time I had left him with anyone since his birth. Every minute felt like an hour. Every footstep in the hallway made my heart stop. Then the door opened, and the bailiff called us back inside. The courtroom was packed with journalists and spectators. Grant sat at the defendant's table with his team of lawyers, his face a mask of controlled anger. His mother sat in the front row behind him, her expression frozen. "Madame Foreperson," the judge said, "has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The foreperson stood. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes. She looked at Grant, then at me, then down at the paper in her hands. "On the count of fraud in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in noise. Journalists scrambled to file reports. Grant's mother let out a strangled sound. Grant himself sat perfectly still, his face draining of all color. "On the count of witness tampering, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of conspiracy to obstruct justice, we find the defendant guilty." 12 counts in total, 12 guilty verdicts. Grant Whitmore, the golden boy of Connecticut real estate, was going to federal prison. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later. The judge gave him 15 years. 15 years for the crimes he had committed against Nora, against me, and against every woman who had been too afraid to come forward until we showed them it was possible. As the bailiffs led Grant away in handcuffs, he passed within 3 feet of where I was sitting. He stopped and looked at me with hatred so pure it made my skin crawl. "This is not over," he whispered. I looked at him calmly. This man I had married, this man I had loved, this man who had tried to destroy me the way he had destroyed everyone else. "Yes, Grant," I said quietly, "it is." They led him away. The courtroom emptied slowly, and I sat there alone, feeling something I had not expected. Not triumph, not joy, just exhaustion, and a hollow ache that I knew would take years to fill. 2 years have passed since that day. I live in Vermont now, in a small farmhouse on a quiet road surrounded by trees. Nothing like the Whitmore estate, nothing like the life I thought I wanted. but it is mine. Every creaky floorboard, every drafty window, every morning when I wake up and the first thing I feel is not fear. Theo is 2 years old now. He has my brown eyes and his father's stubborn streak, though I try not to think about that part. He does not know who his father is. He knows only that I am his mother, that Margot is his aunt, that our rescue dog is his best friend. Someday I will tell him the truth, when he is old enough to understand. When he asks questions that deserve honest answers. But not yet. Not today. Margot visits as often as she can. She got married last year to a good man, another nurse who understands her demanding schedule. I was her maid of honor. I cried through the entire ceremony. Nora and I talk every week on the phone. Her nonprofit has helped over 2,000 women leave abusive relationships. When she gave her acceptance speech for an award last month, she talked about the woman who gave her the courage to fight back. She was talking about me. I work from home now as a consultant for domestic abuse organizations. I cannot practice law anymore because every firm in the country knows my name, knows my story, knows the scandal attached to my past. But I can help other women navigate the legal system. I can teach them how to document abuse, how to protect their assets, how to find the cracks in the fortress that traps them. It is not the career I imagined, but it is the career I was meant to have. Sometimes, late at night, after Theo is asleep and the house is quiet, I stand on my porch and look at the stars. Vermont has the clearest skies I have ever seen. People ask me if I am happy. It is a simple question with a complicated answer. I lost my career. I lost my reputation. I lost years that I will never get back. I still have nightmares about Grant. I still check the locks twice before bed. I still flinch sometimes when a man raises his voice. But I have Theo. I have Margot and Nora. I have mornings where I wake up and the first thing I feel is peace. That is not happiness, not the way I used to imagine it. It is something better. It is freedom. Grant writes to me sometimes from prison, letters I never open. I keep them in a box in my closet. 53 letters so far. 53 attempts to reach me that I will never acknowledge. Last week, I received a different kind of letter. This one came from a woman in Texas whose husband is a wealthy banker with political connections. She had seen my story online. She was trapped in a marriage that was destroying her. She did not know how to get out. I wrote back that same day. I told her my story. I told her about the evidence, the documentation, the allies I found when I thought I had none. I told her that escape was possible, that justice was possible, that freedom was possible, even when everything seemed hopeless. I do not know if she will fight. I do not know if she will win, but I know that someone told her the truth when she needed to hear it. That is all any of us can do. Tell the truth, share our stories, light a candle in the darkness for the women still trying to find their way out. My name is Vivian Calloway. 3 years ago, I was a prisoner in a life I thought I wanted. Today, I am free. If you are listening to this story and you see yourself in it, I want you to know something. You are not crazy. You are not alone. And you are stronger than you believe. Trust your instincts. Document everything. Find your allies. And never give up on yourself. The door is there. I promise you it is there. You just have to be brave enough to walk through it.